Ilhan Omar called John Kennedy a racist. John Kennedy did not flinch, he did not raise his voice, and he certainly did not take the bait. He simply looked across the polished mahogany of the committee table and asked her to say it again. He did not ask her to speak louder, nor did he ask her to speak slower. He merely asked her to state it again, clearly and unequivocally, on the official congressional record. She smiled when she repeated the accusation. It was the unmistakable, practiced smile of someone who firmly believes that a word is a lethal weapon and that she is the absolute only person in the room permitted to wield it. But what she critically failed to notice in that fleeting moment of perceived triumph was the senior senator from Louisiana quietly uncapping his pen, pressing the ink against his yellow legal pad, and methodically setting a trap that was about to turn her own devastating words entirely against her. This particular hearing was supposed to be a mundane, procedural affair regarding immigration, border enforcement numbers, and federal funding allocations. It was precisely the kind of bureaucratic event that fills a Senate hearing room with exhausted junior staffers who endlessly scroll through their phones and cynical reporters who have already written their predictable headlines long before the first question even lands. But the exact fraction of a second that Representative Omar opened her mouth and lobbed that explosive word across the dais, the hearing violently mutated into something else entirely. It became a theater, a brightly lit stage, and she strode onto it with the supreme confidence of an actor who knew the lighting cues by heart. She had executed this precise maneuver before, not once, not twice, but enough times that it possessed a distinct, undeniable rhythm. The playbook was universally understood in modern Washington. Someone dares to disagree with her on policy. She immediately finds the red light of the broadcast camera. She drops the radioactive word, and the entire room is subsequently forced to rearrange its gravitational pull around her personal grievances and manufactured pain. That was the playbook. That was always the playbook, and she had no reason to believe today would be any different. Senator Kennedy sat exactly 4 seats to her left, looking entirely unbothered by the sudden spike in the room's temperature. He had already taken his suit jacket off. His shirt sleeves were not aggressively rolled up for a fight, but simply loosened at the cuffs for comfort. Beside him sat a glass of ice water he had not yet bothered to touch, and directly in front of him rested that iconic yellow legal pad. He had been writing on it long before the gavel struck to start the hearing, filling the pages with impossibly small letters arranged in perfectly neat columns. It was the exact kind of meticulous handwriting that belongs to a man from a generation taught that penmanship is not just a skill, but a fundamental form of respect. Omar's voice carried through the amplification system as it always carried, sharp, echoing, and demanding absolute attention. She deliberately turned her heavy leather chair exactly 45 degrees so that the C-SPAN cameras would perfectly capture her profile. She pointed her finger, not directly at Kennedy's chest, but rather past him, aiming at something much larger, aiming at the very idea of him and everything he represented to her base. "What we are hearing today," she declared, her voice dripping with practiced indignation, "is the language of exclusion. It is the language of racism, and the senator from Louisiana knows exactly what he is doing." The entire room froze and waited for the inevitable explosion. A dozen staffers sharply snapped their heads up from their illuminated screens, and a veteran camera operator in the back row rapidly adjusted his framing to catch the impending fireworks. This was the highly anticipated part of the script, where the accused, older white man was supposed to become visibly enraged. This was the moment he was supposed to sputter into the microphone, lose his temper, and carelessly hand her the exact reactionary soundbite she desperately needed to make the viral social media clip work perfectly. But John Kennedy simply uncapped his pen. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice impossibly low, thick with a southern drawl, and entirely unhurried. He sounded exactly like a polite man leaning over a fence to ask a neighbor a mundane question about a property line. "I want to make absolutely sure I heard you correctly just now. You are saying, permanently on the record, in this congressional hearing, in front of all these national cameras, that I am a racist." He did not rush to fill the heavy silence that followed. He let that terrifying sentence hang suspended in the dead air, allowing the unbearable weight of the silence to completely flood the room. Omar aggressively tilted her chin upward, refusing to yield a single inch of the moral high ground she believed she rightfully occupied. "I am saying that your rhetoric has undeniable racial undertones, and that the marginalized communities directly affected by your policies understand exactly what those undertones mean." Kennedy did not look at her. Instead, he looked down and wrote something on his yellow pad. It was just 2 words, and he deliberately underlined them twice. "That is not what you said, ma'am," he corrected her, his tone devoid of any malice but heavy with unyielding precision. "You used the word racist. I want to know right now if that is your official statement for the record, because words like that have profound weight, or at least they used to." Her jaw shifted just a microscopic fraction, the kind of involuntary tell you only catch if you are closely studying a suspect under interrogation. She had walked into that room expecting blinding heat. She had braced herself for deafening volume. What she received instead was a terrifyingly calm man armed with nothing but a ballpoint pen and a legal pad, treating her explosive political accusation not as a personal insult, but as a sworn deposition. "Yes," she finally snapped back, squaring her shoulders to the microphone. "I stand by exactly what I said." Kennedy nodded slowly. It was not a nod of agreement. It was the specific, grim nod of an attorney who just watched a hostile witness sign a legally binding confession they clearly had not bothered to read. "Good," Kennedy replied smoothly. "I appreciate you putting that on the formal record, Congresswoman, because I am going to need it right there for what comes next." He deliberately set his pen down parallel to the yellow pad, aligning it with the frightening precision of a surgeon laying out his instruments before making the first incision. Most ordinary people, when publicly branded a racist in front of a live national television audience, default to one of 2 disastrous reactions. They either detonate in a fit of rage, which makes for spectacular cable news television but absolutely terrible logical arguments, or they immediately grovel and apologize, which instantly transfers all the institutional power to the accuser while shrinking the accused into a state of permanent submission. Kennedy did neither of these things. He surgically stripped the emotion from the word and treated it strictly as evidence. It was not evidence against his character. It was damning evidence against hers. And that subtle, masterful distinction was about to systematically dismantle everything she had brought into that committee room. The packed gallery sitting behind them did not yet fully comprehend what they were witnessing. They had lined up in the humid Washington morning, hoping to see a gladiatorial blood sport. What they received instead was something far more lethal. They got infinite patience. It was not the kind of warm patience that comforts a friend. It was the terrifying kind of patience that forces you to wonder what devastating secrets this quiet man knows that you do not. Because John Kennedy was not frantically trying to defend his reputation, he was methodically building a prosecutorial record, and the architecture of that record was the entire point of the exercise. As the room nervously settled back into a fragile quiet, Omar quickly began straightening the scattered papers in front of her. She was armed with a massive binder, thick, intimidating, heavily tabbed, and meticulously color-coded. It was the exact kind of Washington prop designed to scream to the cameras, "I came here thoroughly prepared." That kind of visual intimidation works brilliantly when the opponent across the aisle is sloppy, unprepared, or easily flustered. It fails spectacularly when the opponent is completely insulated by a terrifying calm. Sensing the shift in the room's dynamic, she fluidly changed her strategy, adjusting her rhetorical footing the way a seasoned fighter shifts their body weight before delivering a massive second swing. The initial accusation had successfully landed, but now she urgently needed to apply the ideological glue to make it stick permanently. And the specific glue she instinctively reached for was the one she always utilized when cornered, her deeply personal origin story. "Senator Kennedy," she began, her voice suddenly softening into a deliberate, highly practiced cadence of vulnerability. "I came to this country as a political refugee. I lived in a squalid refugee camp for 4 long years. I know intimately what exclusion looks like. I know exactly what it tastes like. And when I sit here and see legislation and policies explicitly designed to keep desperate people who look exactly like me out of this country, I'm going to call it exactly what it is." She paused dramatically, letting the heavy emotional weight of her biography settle over the audience. The gallery visibly leaned forward in their chairs. A well-dressed woman sitting in the second row audibly gasped and placed her hand softly over her mouth. This was the specific part of the performance that almost always worked flawlessly. This was the undeniable checkmate moment where the conservative opponent was forced to either awkwardly back down in defeat or push back and instantly be branded as a heartless, cold-blooded monster on the evening news. Both options were politically fatal. Both options belonged entirely to her. Kennedy's eyes never left her face. His gaze was entirely steady, completely devoid of intimidation but lacking any trace of surrender. He did not interrupt her monologue. He did not nervously shift his weight in his large leather chair. He let her finish her dramatic soliloquy the exact way a polite man lets a stranger finish telling a long joke when he already knows the punchline. "I genuinely respect what you survived, Congresswoman." His voice dropped down half a register, stripping away the senatorial theatrics to reveal something deeply authentic. It was the rare kind of quiet sincerity that actually fills a massive room instead of emptying it out. "I truly do respect it, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart." The entire committee room collectively exhaled for a half-second. For a fleeting moment, it genuinely looked as though he might stop right there and concede the moral victory. He did not stop there. "But your past pain does not give you the inherent right to diagnose my intentions," Kennedy stated, his voice hardening into steel. "And it certainly does not give you the right to diagnose theirs." He lifted his hand and deliberately gestured not just to the crowded gallery sitting behind her, but straight past them, directly into the glowing red lenses of the broadcast cameras, pointing toward the millions of ordinary people watching from their quiet living rooms in small American towns she had never bothered to visit. Omar's hand immediately shot toward her massive binder. She frantically started to pry open the heavy metal rings. "Before you go digging into your prepared notes, ma'am, I would very much like to take a moment to read you some of yours." Kennedy did not reach for his yellow pad. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and produced a completely separate manila folder. It was incredibly thin. He had brought this specific folder the exact way a master fisherman brings one highly specialized lure designed to catch one specific, elusive fish. June of 2019, Kennedy began reading, his voice projecting clearly. "You publicly posted on social media that American foreign policy support for our strongest ally, Israel, is, and I am quoting your exact written words here, all about the Benjamins, baby." The atmosphere in the room violently shifted. It was not a loud disruption, but rather a deep, unsettling murmur, like a massive ocean tide suddenly turning in terribly shallow water. "That is a vile, well-documented anti-Semitic trope, Congresswoman. You know it is. I know it is. Even your own Democratic Party leadership explicitly told you it was, which forced you to issue a half-hearted apology. Sort of." Omar's mouth instantly dropped open to interject, but Kennedy mercilessly steamrolled right through her attempted interruption. "March of 2019, Kennedy continued, flipping a single page in the thin folder. "While speaking publicly about the horrific September 11th terrorist attacks, you casually described the single worst, most devastating terrorist massacre in American history as, quote, some people did something." A visceral sound erupted from the gallery. It was not a shocked gasp, but something much lower, much darker, a deep, painful rumble. It was the unmistakable sound a room makes when it is violently forced to remember a profound trauma it had spent 2 decades desperately trying to forget. "Nearly 3,000 innocent people were slaughtered that Tuesday morning," Kennedy said, his voice trembling just enough to convey raw fury while maintaining absolute control. "Brave firefighters who strapped on 80 pounds of gear and climbed 70 flights of smoke-filled stairs, knowing in their guts they were never coming back down. Terrified office workers who held each other's hands and jumped into the empty sky because the raging jet fuel fire behind them was somehow worse than the agonizing fall. A father who called his weeping wife from the 93rd floor of the South Tower just to say a final goodbye to his infant children, meticulously describing the apocalyptic scene outside his shattered window so she would eventually know exactly where to find his remains in the rubble. And you, Congresswoman, stripped away all their humanity, all their sacrifice, and casually reduced all of that unspeakable horror to, some people did something." The heavy rumble in the gallery grew noticeably louder. A young progressive staffer sitting in the back row shakily set her ceramic coffee mug down on the floor because her trembling hands could no longer hold it steady. And then Kennedy seamlessly continued, slowly turning another crisp page in his folder. "Furthermore, when your own horrified colleagues in the Democratic Party politely asked you to simply acknowledge the profound pain your words caused, you immediately claimed you were being maliciously silenced. You claimed that the valid criticism of your own rhetoric was actually just vicious bigotry. You claimed it was all about your identity, about who you are, rather than what you actually said." Kennedy paused, deliberately letting the ugly architectural structure of her entire political career lay completely exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was the exact same playbook every single time. Violently say something completely indefensible, get rightfully called out on it by the public, immediately claim the ensuing criticism is racist bigotry, and aggressively repeat the cycle. Kennedy slowly closed the manila folder and neatly set it down right next to his yellow pad. Now, Congresswoman, listen to me closely. I am not calling you an anti-Semite. I am not calling you un-American. I am simply reading you your own documented words, and I am asking you a question that I believe is more than fair. He leaned forward over the mahogany table, closing the physical distance between them by just a single inch. If your highly offensive words magically get to be explained away as needing context and nuance, why in the hell don't mine? Omar frantically yanked her massive binder closer to her chest. Her trembling fingers desperately hunted for a specific colored tab. She aggressively flipped through the heavy pages, and for the very first time since the gavel had dropped that morning, she was completely ignoring the television cameras. She was desperately searching for an intellectual escape hatch, looking for a clever, pre-written answer that was simply not inside those pages. It had never been in those pages. She had strutted into this committee room heavily armed with a single, devastating word. He had calmly walked in armed with her entire history of words, and her words were infinitely heavier. The stunned gallery was entirely unsure of where to direct their eyes. Half the room watched Omar frantically tear through her binder in a state of visible panic, while the other half watched Senator Kennedy sit motionless, like a statue carved from granite. The absolute stillness radiating from his side of the dais was deafening. You could physically feel the entire room beginning to collectively understand something profound. It didn't wash over them all at once. It crept in slowly, the exact way a freezing tide comes in, first touching your ankles, then rising to your knees, until you suddenly realize you have been standing entirely submerged in freezing water for a very long time. But Ilhan Omar was a seasoned political street fighter, and she was far from finished. What she bravely attempted next very nearly turned the momentum of the entire room violently back against him. She forcefully slammed the binder shut, shoved it aside, and when she finally spoke again, her entire vocal cadence had radically transformed. Gone was the soaring moral authority voice. Gone was the vulnerable refugee voice. This was her ruthless, aggressive policy voice, the one armed with cold statistics, the one armed with undeniable legislative receipts. Senator Kennedy, she fired back, her eyes locking dead onto his. Since you are so incredibly eager to sit here and talk about historical records, let us talk extensively about yours. She didn't wave her hands, she simply recited the data with lethal precision. You proudly voted against the crucial reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. You voted against the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. You voted against the For the People Act, which would have securely expanded voting access to millions of marginalized Americans. You co-sponsored a draconian bill that would have severely restricted asylum claims for desperate mothers fleeing brutal cartel violence. She rattled off 4 more specific legislative dates, obscure bill numbers, and exact vote tallies from memory. She had thoroughly done her homework. This wasn't the superficial, staffer-prepared binder homework. This was the real kind of opposition research, the kind of research that draws real blood. And in 2021, she continued, her voice rising as she leaned aggressively over the microphone, you actually voted against making lynching a federal hate crime. Lynching, Senator. In the 21st century, you could not even bring yourself to push a green button and vote yes on condemning lynching. The gallery physically shifted, but the momentum did not swing toward Kennedy this time. It violently swung toward her. A harsh, judgmental murmur rapidly rolled through the packed back rows of the committee room. A cynical political reporter sitting in the front row began scribbling furiously, moving his pen so incredibly fast that the tip audibly skipped across the reporter's notebook. 2 skeptical people sitting in the VIP gallery slowly nodded their heads in solemn agreement, and one of them muttered something so deeply derogatory under her breath that the highly sensitive boom microphones almost picked it up for the broadcast. For exactly 40 agonizing seconds, she absolutely had him pinned against the ropes. This was not a cheap theatrical performance. This was masterful, lethal political preparation. She had meticulously built this brutal list of legislative votes the exact way a master carpenter builds a towering wooden staircase, each controversial vote serving as a solid step, each step leading the audience higher and higher into a state of outrage. And the specific vote she purposefully placed at the very top of that staircase was the exact one mathematically designed to make him look like the smallest, most vile man in Washington. Kennedy's jaw visibly tightened. It was not a nervous collapse. It was a rapid, tactical recalibration. the precise bodily reaction of a veteran heavyweight boxer who violently adjusts his defensive stance immediately after catching a brutal, unexpected right hook to the jaw. He took a breath. It was not a deep, dramatic sigh meant for the cameras, nor was it a theatrical gasp of surrender. It was a heavy, working breath, the exact kind of breath a laborer takes right before they bend down to lift something impossibly heavy. "Those are entirely real votes," Congresswoman Kennedy stated flatly, refusing to flinch or look away from her piercing stare. "And I stand firmly behind every single one of them, including the very last one you just named. I opposed that specific legislation entirely because of the flawed, unconstitutional way the legal text was written, not because of what the title claimed it stood against. And you know that just as well as I do. But I certainly noticed that you brilliantly saved that particular vote for the very end of your speech because you knew it sounds the absolute worst on television. That is damn good lawyering on your part, and I respect the tact." He gave her the professional acknowledgement straight up. There was no petty dismissal. There was no condescending eye roll. The millions of voters watching this brutal exchange from their homes felt the massive blow she delivered land squarely on his chin. They were absolutely supposed to feel it, because what John Kennedy masterfully executed next would only work if the entire audience truly believed the damage from her punch was real. But since we are so passionately discussing our records today, Congresswoman, I do not want to talk about my record in Louisiana anymore. I want to talk intimately about yours. And I do not mean your partisan voting record in this chamber. I mean your actual district back home. His right hand smoothly moved back to the yellow legal pad. He deliberately flipped back to the very first page, the specific page he had been meticulously writing on long before the cameras even turned on, the page covered in neat columns and impossibly small letters. He began reading directly from the yellow pad, and he did not read fast. He read with the agonizingly slow cadence of a general contractor reading a devastatingly expensive repair estimate to a terrified homeowner who is about to hear a financial number they absolutely cannot afford. "Minneapolis, your home district," Kennedy drawled, letting the name of the city hang in the air. 37%. Only 37% of the black children currently trapped in the public schools in your district can actually read at a basic grade level. 37. The crushing poverty rate for black families living under your direct leadership is currently nearly 3 times the state average. And violent, bloody street crime in the exact neighborhoods you supposedly represent is up a staggering 40% over the last 5 years. He slowly looked up from the yellow pad, locking his eyes directly onto hers with a gaze that felt like physical force. "You have represented these desperate people for years, Congresswoman. These innocent children in your district literally cannot read their own textbooks. Their terrified mothers are legitimately afraid to walk down the street to the grocery store after the sun goes down. And while your district burns to the ground, you have spent your precious time sitting on national television, frantically calling everyone who disagrees with you a racist." Omar's hand instantly froze mid-page. Her heavily manicured fingers came to a dead rest on a sheet of paper she was absolutely no longer reading. Her mouth opened, and then it snapped shut. Not a single word came out. It was a purely involuntary reflex, the agonizing physical motion that occurs when a desperate human body aggressively attempts to speak, but the shocked brain simply has not yet decided what desperate lie to invent next. The entire gravitational pull of the room completely reversed itself. You could physically feel it happen in your chest. It wasn't accompanied by a loud sound. It was a sudden, violent change in direction, exactly like a massive gust of wind violently changing its course in the middle of an open wheat field. 40 seconds ago, the raging current of the room had been aggressively pulling the narrative toward her inevitable victory. Now, it swung back against her with the force of a hurricane. The counterattack was devastatingly real, and every single soul in that room felt the temperature drop to freezing. For exactly 40 seconds, she had him cornered. Her weaponization of his voting record was genuine, heavy-caliber political ammunition, the kind of ammunition that leaves a permanent, jagged scar long after the political fight is over. But John Kennedy had not walked into this committee room just to survive a media ambush. He had walked in here to completely finish it, completely cornered, stripped of her policy arguments, and bleeding political capital by the second. Omar desperately played her very last card. It was the absolute bottom card, the one sitting at the very foundation of every single political deck she had ever carried into battle. Her voice suddenly cracked. Whether the emotion was authentically real or brilliantly practiced in a mirror truly did not matter in that moment. The crack was undeniably there, and her sudden, Raw vulnerability was placed completely on display for the national cameras. "You are maliciously attacking me right now entirely because of who I am," she pushed out, her voice trembling. "I am a black, Muslim, immigrant woman in America. That is exactly what this is really about. That is what this has always been about from the very beginning." The entire gallery held its collective breath, the silence becoming almost physically unbearable. This was the ultimate political exit ramp. This was the exact perilous moment where a lesser, weaker opponent would make a fatal mistake. They would either aggressively pile on, taking the bait, and instantly looking like a cruel, merciless bully to the watching nation, or they would immediately back off in fear of the racial optics, instantly looking weak and defeated. Two doors were presented. Both doors were completely rigged with explosives. John Kennedy calmly found a third door. When he spoke again, he spoke even more slowly than before. He completely dropped the aggressive lawyer voice. He dropped the theatrical senator voice. He tapped into something much deeper, something residing underneath both of those artificial personas. He spoke with the raw, unvarnished voice of an everyday man. "Congresswoman, I am not attacking who you are," Kennedy said gently, yet firmly. "I have not said a single damn word about your chosen faith today. I have not said a single word about the country where you were born. And I am absolutely never going to, because none of that matters. It does not matter one bit to what I am about to say right now." He quietly set the yellow legal pad face down on the mahogany table. He was completely done reading the devastating numbers. "There is a man watching this exact committee hearing on his television right now," Kennedy began, his eyes looking past Omar and staring directly into the camera lens. "He is sitting somewhere in a modest living room in Michigan, or out in Ohio, or maybe right down in my home state of Louisiana. He is 62 years old. He has been dutifully dragging himself out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, every single morning, for 35 long years. He drives 45 minutes in traffic every day to a physically demanding job that doesn't give a damn about his last name or his feeling. And on Saturday mornings, he volunteers to coach Little League baseball for the kids in his local neighborhood. Black kids, white kids, Hispanic kids. He doesn't sort them by their race. He never has, and he never will." Kennedy's voice dropped again, but not to a theatrical whisper. It dropped down into that rare, sacred register where men finally say the heavy things they have been silently carrying in their chests for a very long time. That decent, hard-working man has never uttered a truly racist word in his entire life. He has never even allowed a racist thought to cross his mind. When his neighbor's basement completely flooded last spring, he didn't pause to check what color his neighbor's skin was before he spent his entire weekend carrying ruined, soaking wet furniture out into the yard. When the poor kid down the street desperately needed a ride to football practice because his dad wasn't around, that man didn't interrogate the kid about his family's heritage first. He just grabbed his truck keys and showed up, because that is exactly what he does. He just quietly shows up for his community. Kennedy's right hand rested completely flat against the table. The palm was open. It was not balled into an aggressive fist, nor was it waving in a grand, calculated political gesture. It was just an open, honest hand. The exact, subconscious way a man places his hand on a table when he is telling you the absolute, unvarnished truth, and he desperately needs you to feel the massive gravity of his words. "But," Kennedy continued, his voice tightening with a protective anger, "that exact same man sits down in his favorite chair, turns on his television every single night, and he is forced to watch someone who looks and sounds exactly like you look directly into the camera and tell him that he is the fundamental problem with the universe. You tell him that his beloved country is an evil, irredeemable problem. You tell him that everything he has spent his entire life building, bleeding, and breaking his back for is actually just a towering monument to racial hate. The heavy, suffocating silence that fell over the congressional hearing room was not merely procedural. It was the profound, agonizing quiet of the forgotten American finally being spoken for. Senator John Kennedy locked eyes with Representative Ilhan Omar, his expression stripped of mere anger and replaced by a devastating, uncompromising clarity as he delivered a rhetorical death blow, telling her that by arrogantly labeling every political disagreement as racist, She had diluted the most powerful word in the English language into absolute meaninglessness. As Omar's shoulders physically collapsed and her once weaponized binder became nothing more than a tragic pile of useless paper, Kennedy issued his definitive verdict. She had maliciously broken the societal fire alarm, guaranteeing that when a real fire finally breaks out, no one will come running with the hoses. This piercing truth radiated through broadcast cables and landed heavily in the living rooms of ordinary Americans, the decent, hard-working citizens across the heartland who have ruthlessly calculated the terrifying social math of our era and realized that absolute silence is drastically cheaper than risking their lifelong careers, their friendships, and their seats at the family Thanksgiving table. They keep their heads down not out of weakness, but out of a hyper-vigilant fear that one weaponized word from the political elites can instantly vaporize 30 years of an honest life. It was a monumental victory for the silent majority, a cinematic and masterful dismantling of a cynical operative on live television, but the true masterstroke was yet to unfold. Because as the gavel struck to adjourn and the exhausted gallery nervously shuffled toward the exits, the fading network cameras completely missed the most dangerous moment of all. In the final, chaotic seconds, Senator Kennedy quietly flipped his yellow legal pad to a fresh page, uncapped his pen one last time, and methodically began drafting the undeniable foundation for an entirely new, far more devastating trap, one that is about to permanently alter the political landscape, and exactly what we will uncover in the next thrilling breakdown.